We've been checking in each week since the start of the legislative session with a top legislative leader. This week we finish up those interviews with House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox. What are his takeaways as the halfway point of the session approaches, and what are his top priorities? Joining me now is Representative Wilcox. Welcome back to the program. Good to see you. In a short session, if we stretch these interviews out a week at a time, we get to the mid-session almost. So I guess I'll start by asking you a question I don't think I asked your colleagues in leadership, which is, what's your assessment as you approach the almost halfway point of how this 60-day session is going from your perspective in the minority?
Well, I would say, first of all, this session has been about fixing problems that were created in past sessions. A lot of energy, a lot of airtime consumed in the long-term healthcare tax. We had a couple of different routes to go with that. Implementing it as is would be the worst choice, and the governor and the Democratic leaders recognize that. The best choice might have been to simply repeal, or repeal with a replacement that was proposed by Representative Drew Stokesbury, which would have been a private sector, affordable and optional choice for people going forward. And what ended up happening was an 18-month delay, which may be better than it sounds, because that gives what could be a wiser and better legislature in 23 a chance to either fix this thing or repeal it. And then some other repairs that have been necessary are due to the public safety and policing bills that were passed a year ago. And there's been some minor fixes, some nibbling around the edges. There are some major bills that are necessary and somewhat in doubt right now. And I think that's going to be probably the most important thing that we find out on cutoff, which is, are those important fixes to the police reform bills going to come out of committee?
And on that topic, just do you have a particular bill or issue around police reform in mind? Would this have to do with vehicular pursuits? Is it, I know two of the fixed bills did already pass off the floor of the House. So what are you watching for in terms of what still needs to be done from your perspective?
Yeah, there are three that are critical for me. First of all, there's the Eric Robertson vehicular pursuit bill. I think that one is possibly going to come out maybe in sadly watered down form, but that gives us a chance to work on this, and that clarifies when the police can give chase in vehicles. Another, I think, is HB 2730. That is a bill that was dropped by the Democratic chair of the committee, Roger Goodman, and that has to do with allowing police to detain suspects of violent crimes based on reasonable suspicion, which is a very middle of the road approach. It's used by most states, and it allows the police to detain. It doesn't allow them to hurt them, but detain suspects based on a reasonable suspicion, like they fit the description of a perpetrator. And then one other that's getting a little less attention, I think it's HB 1656, has been around in one form or another for a few years. It's always been close, but never made it. It's by Dan Griffey, and it addresses retail theft. And this is one of the things that is kind of gutting our communities, especially our urban communities, where people don't always have the ability to, drive an extra 5 miles to a retailer. Retailers, grocers are shutting down because their stores are being looted. And over the last few years, it's become increasingly difficult to control shoplifting and other kinds of retail theft. We absolutely, for the sake of these neighborhoods and the people that live in them, have to give the store owners and the police the opportunity to maintain law and order and protect their property.
So when you think about where House Republicans are coming from on issues like police accountability and police reform, responding to the rise in crime, whether that's property-related crime or violent crime, do you feel like at this point you all are kind of worlds apart, planets apart, or is there some good bipartisan work being done here to try to find what I think the speaker called sort of the sweet spot or the Goldilocks spot on some of this.
Yeah, well, I believe that many Democrats would like to find that sweet spot, and there might be a lot of common ground with Republicans in this, but I think that they are deeply troubled by the fact that last year and the year before were unique moments in time, and they passed bills that were so permissive towards lawbreakers and so restrictive towards police that they're unworkable. That was the only moment that they could have passed those bills. The moment has passed. Most people with common sense understand that you have to fix these things, but it's really hard to go backwards in politics. And so the supporters of the original bill, I think, are making it very, very difficult for Democrats to dial these bills back to the place that works for everybody. And so this is why there's some doubt about whether or not these will pass.
In terms of, you talked about walk cares, police reform, responding to crime. What are some other areas where in this short session you see an opportunity for your caucus to get some of its bills heard and possibly passed? It does, I mean, this is just my observation, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but it seems like there have been hearings for some of your House Republican member bills that sort of surprised me to see them happen. We'll be talking to the chair and ranking Republican on the House Education Committee. They did a public hearing on Representative Walsh's civics education bill. That was a little bit of a surprise. There was a House hearing this week on Representative Corey's emergency powers reform bill.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to what I just said. Last year was this unique moment in time. Some things that are almost unimaginable were passed last year. And, now we're in this moment where maybe there's some reaction, maybe sober heads are beginning to prevail a little bit, and they're very worried about, are they going to hang on to their majority when so many people have moved on, and I think look back with some regret at the things that they did last year. And, are these things going to pass? Some of them might pass, but I think that there is a strong desire on the part of House and Senate Democrats to come to the middle and look more reasonable. But it remains to be seen whether or not their supporters will allow that to happen. And kind of the minimal direction that you can go is, okay, let's give these bills a hearing. That allows us all to look reasonable. And it may be that some of these will get a vote, or at least having the hearing allows them, the majority who sets the agenda, to sort of put their finger in the air and see which way the wind's blowing, and see if they have the votes to move these things. And we don't know that yet. We will have a little better idea if they start coming out of the Rules Committee. But I agree, there's some important ideas that are coming out, and I think one of the ones that is the most difficult for them is looking at reasonable reform of a governor's emergency powers. And we've always said that the majority should prevail. This is designed for a worst case scenario, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic governor. You've seen Governor Inslee, I think, come out pretty strongly against these things. You've seen hearings on a Republican bill over here that would be effective. You've seen hearings in the Senate on a Democratic bill that we saw as mostly window dressing. And if one of these passes, none of them, by the way, will end the governor's emergency powers. It will just give the majority in the House and Senate the opportunity to do that and force everyone to be on the record one way or the other.
When you talk about the idea that the Democrats have gone too far from your perspective on some of these issues, especially around, well, not, on the question of emergency powers, you're saying the legislature should step in and do something, but for instance, on police reform, I do want to come back, and this is sort of a broader question about kind of an organizing principle for the work that your caucus is doing. Speaker Jenkins has made it very clear that one of the top 4 priorities for the House Democratic Caucus is racial equity and leaning into this time that we're in. It's been described as a racial reckoning, trying to address systemic racism, trying to really change systems that have not traditionally worked for Black and brown citizens, for minorities, for people of color. And so the police reforms were really built around that. Like, policing isn't working for these communities, something's got to change. What's the animating philosophy for your caucus in the context of COVID, in the context of this racial reckoning, in the context of what's happening kind of in this country and in this state right now?
Well, first, I would say that I have never seen as many Black and brown people want to be Republicans as I'm seeing right now. And I think this idea that every racial group moves in lockstep is not very democratic at all. And I think many people see that lawlessness in big cities and even smaller cities victimizes the people that live there, and often victimizes the people that are already struggling under disadvantages that many of us are not as familiar with. You know, what I've always said, you know that I was a history major. When it comes to education, for example, we should absolutely teach the good and the bad history of our country and not shy away from that. We should talk about the history of racism and the people that have been hurt by racism. But it doesn't help us go forward when you do it in a way that demonizes people now that weren't part of building that. When it comes to police and race, there's all kinds of common ground around. We have to find ways to get people out of that profession that will dishonor it and are not equipped to do that. But at the same time, so many of the things that have happened over the last year have victimized people that were already victimized by the system, and that didn't improve anything. And that's, you know, why you see in many cases people of color asking for how do we get back to effective policing, because chaos is good for nobody that lives in an urban area.
There are many challenging issues facing the state and facing the country in 2022. Homelessness and housing is a topic we've discussed recently on this program. That's certainly one. Poverty and just the fact that the economic recovery has been uneven is another. I know you're very focused on the, you often talk about the experience of people in rural Washington and how they're faring economically and otherwise. At the same time, the state's balance sheet is looking pretty healthy. This is a supplemental budget year, but when you think about the sort of difficult problems the state is facing, and then you think about an economic or budgetary policy for the state in a supplemental year, what do you think the most effective thing the state legislature could do with a supplemental budget right now? What I hear Democrats saying is strategic, targeted spending to try to reach those who are struggling the most. What would you say?
Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons this has been an uneven economic recovery has, and there's quite a bit of national information that's beginning to come out about this, is all the measures that were taken as a result of COVID have been deeply uneven. And one of the things that I think is just outrageous is, you know, people that do the hardest work, folks that have menial jobs, people that work out in the woods, people that produce, you know, all of our building materials, sawmills and steel mills, people that produce our food, that work in grocery stores, that drive trucks. They've been coming to work every single day. And that has allowed lots of other people to stay home and be safe. And I think in so many cases, we've done things that have been fine for those that have white collar jobs, can work from home, and sometimes just come at the expense of everyone that has to work every day and go to a place that maybe wasn't as safe. And I think we're also finding that so many of the assumptions that we've made about what's safe are, you know, either only partially right or sometimes wrong. And that's something that I think we have to face and try to provide some redress in the future. The other thing is you're right, we are rolling with money, and there's a lot of things that you can do that are targeted. Probably the most important one that was done last year came because Drew Stokesbury, our House Republican budget lead, decided in the House Republican budget to fund the working families tax credit that had been proposed 10 years ago and passed, never once funded. All these years, Democrats have been writing the House budget, never funded it. So it was a great political talking point, but it was never funded. House Republicans were the first ones that proposed funding that, and as a result, it did get funded in the end. And Drew Stokesbury has proposed that we increase funding for that in the future. We should do that. There are two taxes that are among the most burdensome for struggling families. That's the state sales tax. And believe it or not, there's a Democratic bill to reduce the state sales tax over the Senate by, I think, 1%. That would be a big deal. And it wouldn't be for 3 days. It would be for a whole year. Republicans have overwhelmingly co-sponsored that, and it hasn't got a hearing. That would be a pretty good bill to pass in today's world. We've got Republican bills here in the House that address property tax, which is one of the things that makes housing so expensive. It's a fundamental cost that everybody has to pay in order to have a roof over their house. It's been one of the ones that has increased at the most rapid rate. And these often have been targeted by addressing, the first increment of value. Ed Orcutt has a couple bills in that arena, and those need to pass. It's using tax policy. It's not spending, although it's odd, the Democrats won't respect that kind of tax spending when they often categorize any kind of tax reduction as somehow a tax expenditure. And there's one other one that I want to talk about that's a little bit different from what you are describing, but that will help address this in the long term as well. And that's Representative Jacqueline Maycumber, who has a bill that recognizes that if you don't live in an urban area, you probably don't have access to a lot of vocational training through skill centers. If you live 3 hours from Spokane, for example, you don't get to access that really important resource that in the long run is going to address generational poverty, because someone who doesn't have a family background in college is more likely to take advantage of vocational training. And we are hoping that we get that bill out of committee today. I don't think it came out yesterday. I've talked to the speaker. I've talked to the governor. I appreciate the fact, I think both of them have put some effort into this. There's been some resistance coming out of the office of OSPI. And that's a critical bill that will make a difference in the long term. It is HB 1536.
What do you think about so just to be clear, as you're thinking about spending and kind of investing in particular programs and trying to address problems by saying we'll spend more here or there versus broader across the board tax cuts, what I hear you saying is you think that some of both makes sense. When it comes to something like homelessness and the lack of housing, and we've been talking about this on this program, and legislators are talking about this. Is there something specifically that could be done to speed up the response that you think would be effective, given that we're something like 250,000 housing units short, given that there are so many people living in such difficult conditions right now, literally in tents by the side of the road, by the side of the freeway. And a lot of the public, I think, feels like this is just this new normal that will never change, that government doesn't have the capacity to respond at scale. What more could the state be doing?
Well, let's figure out how we got here first. You didn't get here overnight. If there is one theme that has been consistent for the 12 regular sessions now that I've been here for, it's that every year we vote on things that make it harder and more expensive to build homes. And now the the chickens are home to roost. We've been passing bill after bill after bill. There's not been one single bill that created this crisis. It's been a dozen bills every year. Sometimes it increases the cost of housing. For example, all of the very expensive changes in the state building code that people just ignore because they get to tie it into carbon, for example, or they get to tie it into some environmental issue that maybe could be addressed in a way that wasn't so devastating to the 250,000 families that don't have housing now. When you look at rural areas, the whole thrust of our efforts over the last 20 years has been to make it harder and sometimes impossible to build a home in places that often had plenty of capacity. You know, it's almost impossible now to build a home on a farm for someone's child. These things have all contributed to 250,000 families not having a place to live now. So a big part of what we're going to have to do is to reverse policies in the past. It's very much similar to what I talked about earlier, except it is you know, a lot more bills and a lot more time having contributed to this. We have had proposals that were comprehensive from Representative Andrew Barkas for the 5 years that he has been here. He has personally housed more than anyone in this, in either of the two chambers, I think. And instead of, you know, getting together and passing these bills, those have become the most ideologically charged issues that we've seen in our state. And they've set the tone for the last 2 or 3 sessions. All he's wanting to do is make it possible to house more people. We're backing many of the policies that are coming out right now.
What about
an
the,
amazing
you know,
number of those have been thrown away in the past.
I imagine Democrats would say it would be a big step backwards if you were to allow, for instance, you know, building houses today that are going to stand for the next 50, 60, 70, 100 years, and they're not taking advantage of the, you know, most efficient materials. And if, you know, the governor said, and I keep quoting him on this, but you know, given your district, you can relate to this. He said, we're not going to build houses to the base of Mount Rainier. So containing sprawl, keeping building within the GMA boundaries, trying to, you know, build more efficiently for the future. Those all seem, you know, Democrats would say those are all laudable, purposeful priorities.
Well, you should judge policies by their results. And the result is we've got a polluted Puget Sound. No one has ever put the money that's necessary into water treatment. So almost every major urban area is pouring untreated water when we have weather events. So we didn't do a whole lot for the environment. And the other result is we're short 250,000 housing units for families. Our state, our legislature is full of good intentions. It's full of people that want to pass a bill with their name on it that you know, ties into whatever is most popular to their constituents. But in the end, we have to look at the results that we produced, and the results are 250,000 people, families that can't be housed.
Just in the couple minutes we have left, the governors, you and I have talked a lot about sort of the state of democracy, the state of political discourse these days. The governor has this proposal that's gotten a hearing in the Senate to create a crime for somebody to make false statements about election results with the goal of inciting lawlessness. And if that speech was to incite an act of lawlessness, the person, in this case would be an elected official or a candidate for office, could potentially be charged criminally. What do you think of this idea? Is this the kind of policy that's needed to try to restore some balance, or at least put some guardrails on discourse these days? And maybe the word isn't discourse, because discourse is a positive word, but on, you know, what the governor would call crying fire in the theater of democracy.
Yeah. He and I talked about this the other day, and you and I have talked about the topic an awful lot on and offline. I think that we all have a responsibility to, you know, tell the truth as we see it. And I've spoken many times about the fact that although there's plenty of room for error, I have not witnessed mass voter fraud here. And I've disagreed with people in my own party that say that there is. Every 4 years, a different side is talking about voter fraud and voter integrity. There's been 100 pieces of video come out from 4 years ago when disappointed people were talking about how is it possible that a Republican was elected. So I think we all have responsibility for this. We all have to speak out. I just cannot imagine how it's a good thing to take the responsibility for moderating speech out of individuals' hands and turning it into a crime when it comes to political speech. I think that's a step that we don't want to take.
I've got less than a minute on the clock. A final closing statement.
Well, this is, I think, kind of a pivotal session. We always hear about how important things are. I feel like there's an awful lot of opportunity here because of what I said before. We're past this moment in time when things that were almost unimaginable were happening. And people, I think, are ready to dial it down. I know that doesn't seem possible to everybody else, but I think the shock of watching grocery stores being looted, the shock of watching things that seemed outlandish 5 years ago happen now is making people long for a time when government worked. And that's what all of us that are elected should strive for.
Okay, House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox concluding our leadership interviews. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.